It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you. I'm a Benedictine monk, and you might say, why aren't I in my monastery? And the answer is that I am in my monastery, because I have two monasteries. One is with walls, and my main monastery, I live in London, my monastery is there, but I have another monastery which has grown out of that, which is a monastery without walls. And it's a monastery that's a community that has come into being through the practice of silence, through meditation over the last 30 years. And so this evening I'd like to share with you something of the vision and the life of that monastery without walls, and in particular the practice of meditation. And the tradition of meditation that we teach and we practice is a very simple one, and the simplicity of it is what is most difficult. If it was more complicated, it would be easier, but it's actually very simple, so it's more demanding. But it's a tradition that comes to us from the Desert fathers and mothers, who were the early Christian monks of the Egyptian desert. They began their movement as a lay movement. It wasn't the early monks were not clerics, were not priests. Even Saint Benedict was not a priest. And it was a lay movement. And it was a grassroots movement. It was a radical movement, a radical Christian attempt to live the gospel as a transformational experience, to be changed, to be fully enlightened, awakened, and united with Christ. And one of the interesting features of the Christian desert tradition, is the way that it communicates its wisdom, not through long books and theological treatises, but most of all by example. The Desert fathers and mothers taught their disciples by example, and but also their sayings were collected. I don't know if any of you have read those, the sayings of the Desert fathers. It's one of the great wisdom texts of the Christian tradition, and if you haven't read them, I would urge you to. They are very short little sayings, of sometimes humorous, sometimes a bit like Zen stories. In fact, some of the Zen stories are and the Desert Father stories are the same. So they grow out of a monastic wisdom which is experiential. It's about experience, not theory. They weren't arguing about theological abstractions. They were concerned about prayer as a way of transformation. And above all, about prayer as a way of self-knowledge. There's a story from that tradition of an old monk walking with his young disciple beside the river. And the young disciple is asking all kinds of questions about the river. He says, what is its name? Where does it come from? And where's it flowing? And how deep is it? And how cold is it? And eventually the older monk gets frustrated with this, and he pushes the young one into the river. And then he says, now you know. You know the river, so you don't have to ask any more questions about it. And that is somewhat typical of their... And then he helps the young monk out of it. But that's quite typical of the spirit of the desert wisdom. It's about immersion. You've got to get into it, not just stand back and look at it and think about it. So this evening I'd like to give you a few answers to questions you haven't yet raised. I'll speak about meditation primarily as a way of self-knowledge. but also I'd like to give you the opportunity to jump into the river, and we'll take a little time for meditation together. And I'll share with you the simple method that this desert tradition has given us, and that has brought about this monastery without walls that brings me here. Another very interesting saying of the Desert Fathers and Mothers is this. Self-knowledge is more important and a more valuable acquisition than the ability to work miracles. Self-knowledge is more important than the power to work miracles. So it's this self-knowledge that they were concerned with, and that I think is at the core of all spirituality. And indeed, human beings in this vision are not human beings on a spiritual journey, but we are spiritual beings on a human journey. And when you think about the distinction between those two phrases, it begins perhaps to change your perspective. We are not human beings on a spiritual journey, but we are spiritual beings making a human journey. And that journey, we could say, is the journey to self-knowledge, to knowing ourselves as we truly are. And throughout the Christian tradition, self-knowledge has always been declared to be a necessary foundation. We have to know ourselves before we can know God. Self-knowledge is the condition, it's the foundation for our knowledge of God. So we can see how central, how important this idea of self-knowledge is certainly to the Christian contemplative tradition, which is where I'm speaking from, but indeed to the whole of the Christian tradition. We go back to the words of Jesus, where he tells us that those who follow him, who are his disciples, must be able to leave self behind, that we must lose ourselves in order to find ourselves. And in order to lose ourselves, we have to let go of all our possessions. So here are the elements of self-knowledge. Some kind of self-transcendence, okay? Leaving self behind. Doesn't mean beating yourself up. It doesn't mean a negative kind of spirituality. It doesn't mean the denial of pleasure. But leaving self behind refers to an experience of self-transcendence, going beyond the ego level of consciousness to a deeper or higher level of awareness. So self-transcendence, but also some experience of poverty of spirit, the leaving of all our possessions. And both of these elements are essential to our practice and understanding of meditation. In meditation, we take the attention off ourselves. That's the simplest way to transcend yourself, is stop thinking about yourself, which is a pretty difficult thing to do. Because as soon as you start thinking about anything, it isn't long before you start thinking about yourself. Or you think about whatever it is, causes of the First World War, or the solution to our economic crisis, or your own careers. Whatever it is we think about it with reference to ourselves, or to some benefit or advantage that it will bring to us. So any kind of thinking is in some way linked to ourselves as the center of consciousness. So this explains why in meditation we do something quite radical and quite amazing. We choose to take the attention off ourselves, to stop thinking about ourselves altogether. That's the essence of meditation. And of course, something in us both is excited by that because it promises us the experience of transcendence and some higher kind of self-knowledge, but at the same time we resist it, we're frightened of it, because how can I stop thinking about myself? How can I stop being the center of my universe? I am the center of my universe. That's the most natural thing in the world. St. Catherine of Siena or St. John of the Cross, all the great Christian mystics tell us something different. They say, God is the center of my soul. So, in beginning to move into transcendence, we are coming closer to God. The experience feels as if we are losing ourselves, but in fact we are finding ourselves at a deeper, more real and more complete level of reality.